The morning air smelled of antiseptic and coffee as Clara Hayes pushed open the heavy glass door of the hospital. She had been awake all night rushing to finish a presentation for her small marketing firm, and she had dark circles under her eyes. Her boss had called her at sunrise, ordering her to deliver printed materials to a client who had been hospitalized after a plane crash. She held a manila folder tight against her chest, praying she would not be late. The hallways buzzed with nurses and visitors, the polished floor reflecting the harsh, fluorescent lights. Clara followed the room numbers until she found the one written on the note, room 315. She knocked once lightly, then pushed the door open. The room was quiet except for the soft beeping of monitors. A tall man lay in the bed, his left arm in a sling, his face bruised but handsome. His dark hair was mussed, and he had the kind of presence that filled the space, even as he lay half reclined. He turned his head slowly, his blue eyes sharp despite the exhaustion, and said in a low voice, "You are late." Clara froze, her cheeks flushing. "I am sorry, I thought you were expecting me." He studied her for a long moment, then said, "I was expecting someone, but not you." He gestured to the chair beside the bed. "Sit." Clara hesitated, her heart pounding. She had no idea why she obeyed, but she sat clutching the folder on her lap. The man's gaze flicked to it and then back to her. He asked, "What are you carrying?" Clara blinked. "This is a presentation for Mr. Carter. I was told to deliver it here." The corner of his mouth twitched into something between amusement and disbelief. He said quietly, "You are looking at Mr. Carter." Clara nearly dropped the folder. Her boss had told her Liam Carter was the coldest, most ruthless CEO in the industry, a man who could make or break a company with a single email. And here he was, bruised, tired, but very much alive, staring at her as if she had walked into his story, uninvited. She stammered, "I am so sorry, I did not know." He reached out with his uninjured hand. "Take it." Clara handed him the folder carefully. He flipped through the pages, scanning each slide with the precision of a man who missed nothing. His expression gave away nothing until he closed the folder and set it on the side table. He looked back at her and said, "You stayed up all night to finish this, did you not?" Clara's mouth went dry. "Yes, sir." Liam nodded slowly. "Then you will stay and explain it to me yourself." Her eyes widened. "Sir, I'm not supposed to. I am only an account assistant." Liam's gaze pinned her to the chair. "I do not care what your title is. I want to hear the story from the person who worked on it." Clara's heart pounded, but she opened the folder and began speaking. She walked him through the research, the strategy, the creative concept. Her voice shook at first, but grew steadier as she saw him listening. Really listening. When she finished, Liam was silent for a long time. Then he said, "You know, this proposal is better than what your boss pitched last month?" Clara blinked. "You saw the last one?" He nodded. "I see everything in this company." Clara's chest swelled with a mix of pride and fear. Liam reached for the nurse call button, then stopped. Instead, he looked at her again and said, "I want you at the follow-up meeting tomorrow. Bring this exact energy and do not let your boss water it down." Clara's breath caught, "Sir, that is not my decision." Liam's voice softened, but his words were firm. "It is now." Before she could respond, a nurse entered carrying a tray. She glanced between them, surprised to see Clara sitting so close. Liam waved her off, saying, "We are done here for now." The nurse left and Clara stood, her knees shaking. She whispered, "Thank you, sir. I will be ready." Liam leaned back against the pillows, his gaze following her as she left the room, just as his phone buzzed. He glanced at it, then smiled faintly, texting a single line. Clara stepped into the hallway, her heart racing. She had just met the man her entire company had been desperate to impress, and somehow he had asked her to present the project herself. She could barely process what had just happened. When she reached the hospital entrance, her phone buzzed. She pulled it from her pocket and froze. The message was from an unknown number, but the words made her stomach flip. "Do not be late tomorrow." A tired-looking woman in a hospital gown signed the release forms, while her newborn slept in a plastic bassinet. Clara kept her smile steady, her voice soft and professional. and when it was over, she thanked her and slipped back out into the corridor. Her legs felt heavy as she walked toward the elevators, her mind still circling the wrong room. The man with the piercing eyes and the quiet, broken voice. Back outside, the rain had eased into a mist. The street shone slick and gray under the city lights. Clara pulled her coat tight around her shoulders and headed for the train. She kept seeing his face in her mind as the train rattled beneath the streets. And even when she got back to her cramped apartment, the image stayed. Liam Carter, battered but unbroken like someone carved from ice and fire. She tossed her coat onto the couch and sat at her small table, flipping open her laptop. She needed to finish the final pitch deck for the Helix Technologies account. The same company Liam owned. If they won it, her little agency might survive. If they lost it, everything would collapse around her and her team would scatter like dust. She rubbed her eyes and muttered to herself, "Focus, Clara, just focus." She worked through the night, rearranging slides, polishing data lines, checking every word. Twice, she almost messaged her boss to tell him she could not do it, but she stopped each time and pushed harder. By the time the gray light of dawn leaked through her blinds, she had something that almost looked like hope. She arrived at the agency offices, bleary-eyed and running on caffeine. Her boss, Alan, glanced up from his desk and frowned. "You look like hell." Clara forced a smile. "Thanks, I feel worse," he muttered. "As long as you can sell Carter. As long as—" On this, Clara froze mid-step. Alan looked at her puzzled. "You do know Liam Carter will be at the presentation in person, right?" The words punched the air from her lungs. She croaked, "He is coming here." Alan nodded. "Yeah, rumor is he leaves his hospital bed. Just for this, so do not screw it up." Clara stumbled to her desk, her mind spinning. She had seen him. She had sat by his bed. She could still hear his voice. By noon, she had convinced herself he would not remember her. She had been just a stranger who wandered into his room. He probably met 100 people every day. She repeated the thought like a shield as the team loaded their presentation onto the big screen in the conference room. At 2 o'clock precisely, the glass doors opened and Liam Carter walked in. He looked different from the hospital, though no less arresting. He wore a dark suit tailored to perfection, his injured arm still in a sling, his expression carved from marble. His eyes swept the room, and for one suspended second they locked on hers. Clara's heart stopped. Then he gave the faintest, almost imperceptible smile before turning to Alan. The meeting began. Clara stayed near the back trying to disappear, but her mind screamed. Liam Carter was here, standing 5 feet away, listening to their pitch. She forced herself to breathe and to focus on the words on the screen. The presentation ended to polite applause. Alan beamed. Liam asked a few sharp questions that sliced through the room like scalpels. Clara answered one without thinking, her voice steady, her logic clear. Liam's gaze flicked to her again, unreadable. When it was over, he thanked them in a voice smooth and cold and left with his entourage like a tide retreating. Clara sat down hard in a chair, her knees weak. Alan clapped her on the shoulder. "Good work, you might have saved us." She went home that night hollow and electric all at once. She lay awake staring at the ceiling, thinking of his eyes. The next morning, a message waited in her inbox from Liam Carter. "Just 4 words you walked into destiny." Clara stared at the screen, her heart hammering so hard she could feel it in her fingertips. She read the message again and again. "You walked into destiny." The words glowed against the pale morning light spilling through her blinds. She whispered to herself, "It has to be a joke. Maybe he sends things like this to everyone. Maybe he forgot who I am." But something deep inside her knew he had not forgotten. She deleted the message twice, then restored it both times, and finally shoved her phone into her bag and went to work. Her mind raced the whole commute, her eyes seeing nothing but his face, his voice, that quiet, calm certainty. She wanted to pretend it had not shaken her, but it had cracked something open inside her, something she thought had long died. The office buzzed louder than usual. Everyone whispered about the pitch. Helix had not chosen a firm yet, but Alan looked confident. He kept striding through the open floor, declaring to anyone who would listen that they had nailed it. Clara kept her head down, her hands trembling over her keyboard. She could not tell anyone she had been in his hospital room. She could not tell anyone about the message. By noon, another email arrived, this one to Alan from Helix requesting a second meeting. Clara caught her breath. Alan grinned at the team. Get ready, people. This could be it. That night, Clara could not eat. She walked circles in her small apartment, whispering to herself, "Stay calm. It is just work. It means nothing." She fell asleep at her desk and dreamed of hospital halls lined with glass and of blue eyes opening in the dark. The next afternoon, they returned to Helix headquarters. The building rose over the ocean, its glass walls reflecting the gray sky. The receptionist guided them to a private top-floor boardroom. Clara tried not to stare at the sweeping view or at her reflection, pale and small in the mirrored elevator doors. Liam Carter was already waiting seated at the far end of the table. His arm was still in a sling, but his presence filled the room like a storm contained in glass. He said nothing at first, only watched as Alan began the revised pitch. Clara stayed near the corner, her notebook clasped in white-knuckled hands. Halfway through, Liam interrupted, his voice soft but cutting. "You are selling numbers to people who live on vision." He tapped a finger on the table. "This is not bold, it is safe, and safe is dead." Alan stammered. "We can adjust." Sir Liam's eyes shifted to Clara. "What do you think, Miss Hayes?" Her throat closed. Everyone turned to look at her. She forced air into her lungs and said quietly, "I think he is right. The data matters, but it is meaningless without story, without risk. People do not remember what is safe. They remember what scared them a little." Silence stretched. Liam's gaze locked on hers. Then he said, "Show me." Clara's mind raced, but her voice stayed steady. She walked to the screen, took the remote, and rewrote the pitch in real time. She threw out the safe graphs and spoke from instinct about dreams, about fear, about being willing to burn the old world to build a new one. She did not know where the words came from, only that they poured out like fire. When she finished, the room was silent. Then Liam smiled. Not faint, not cold, but real, like sunlight breaking through steel. He said, "That is what I wanted to hear." Alan blinked and stammered. "So does this mean," Liam stood and said, "it means you have a chance?" Then he looked at Clara. "You especially." He left the room with his entourage trailing behind him, leaving the air crackling in his wake. Alan grabbed her shoulders, whispering, "What did you just do?" Clara whispered back, "I have no idea." That night in her apartment, she stood at the window, staring at the black ocean and her reflection in the glass. She felt like she had stepped through a door that could never be closed again. Her phone buzzed a new message. This one only said, "Dinner tomorrow, 7. Do not be late." Clara barely slept the night before the dinner. Her thoughts spun in frantic loops. She stood in front of her closet for almost an hour, staring at the same 3 dresses hanging like ghosts. None of them felt right. They were all too plain, too small for the scale of someone like him. But she had nothing else, so she chose the simple black one that had carried her through her last agency interview and hoped it would not betray her. The restaurant sat high above the city in the glass crown of a tower, its windows reflecting the lights of the skyline like fire. Liam Carter was already there when she arrived, his sling gone, his movements precise like a blade. She followed the maitre d' through a hush of crystal and low music, and felt the world tilt when Liam stood to greet her, his gaze steady as if he had been waiting centuries. She sat across from him, her pulse loud in her ears, the table between them glowing with candlelight. He said nothing for a while, just watched her like he was reading every crack in her armor. At last he said, "You are not afraid to burn things down, are you?" Clara blinked, unsure how to answer. He continued, "Most people who stand in front of me flinch. You do not flinch." She forced her voice steady, maybe because I have nothing left to lose. He smiled faintly, not with amusement, but with recognition. "Tell me why you really walked into that room that day." She swallowed hard. "I told you it was a mistake." He shook his head. "No, you were looking for something, you just did not know it yet." The waiter appeared like a ghost with wine. They barely touched their glasses. Liam asked about her past, about the agency, about the campaigns she had built and lost. She answered carefully, aware every word mattered. He listened like no one ever had, eyes sharp but not cruel. And when she asked about the crash, his voice dropped softer like a secret. The plane went down fast, fire, metal silence. Then I woke up and realized I had been living like I was already dead. Clara felt something twist in her chest. She whispered, and now he said, "Now I want to build something that scares me again." When dinner ended, he walked her to the elevator. They stood close enough that the air buzzed. He said, "Tomorrow you will present your vision to the board. Not just me, all of them." She froze. "Tomorrow?" He nodded. "If you want this, you show them what you showed me." Her heart lurched. "I will try." He shook his head. "Do not try set the room on fire." The elevator doors opened. She stepped inside, her mind spinning, and as they closed, she saw him still standing there, hands in his pockets, like a storm disguised as a man. That night, she worked until her eyes burned, tearing apart the pitch deck. Building it again from the bones up, she poured every piece of herself into it. Not just data, but defiance by dawn. Her tiny apartment floor was littered with crumpled notes and empty coffee cups. Her laptop screen blazed with something wild and alive. The next morning, she walked into Helix headquarters with her hair still damp from the shower, her hands trembling but her spine straight. The boardroom loomed vast and cold glass walls, spilling light across the polished floor. The directors sat like statues around the table. Liam at the head, watching her with that unreadable half-smile. She began to speak, and the world narrowed to her voice. She told them not about profits, but about fear. About how fear drives people more than logic. How stories make people move, how companies only survive if they dare to become myth. Her words cut the air like sparks. The room stayed silent, their faces carved from stone. Then Hale, the chairman of the board, leaned back. His eyes cold and amused, he said, "Pretty speeches do not build empires, girl. They burn them down." Clara met his gaze and said, "Maybe this empire needs a fire." Liam's mouth curved just slightly. When she finished, the room stayed silent. Then murmurs began. Hale frowned, but others nodded, impressed. Liam stood and said, "Meeting adjourned." As they filed out, Hale shot her a look like a blade, but Liam only said quietly to her, "Well done," then left without another word. She stood alone in the cavernous room. Her breath, shaking, her hands still buzzing. She did not know if she had won or doomed herself, but for the first time in years, she felt alive. Clara walked out of the boardroom on legs that felt like glass, the whispers of the directors still echoing in her ears. She stepped into the elevator alone, her reflection pale and small in the mirrored walls. Her phone buzzed once, a message from Alan. "Holy hell, what did you say in there? They are talking about you." She typed back, "I do not know," and closed the screen, her hands still trembling. Back at the agency office, the team swarmed her with questions, but she said nothing, only locked herself in the small conference room and stared at the skyline. Her heart racing, she had spoken like a person who had nothing to lose, and now the world might actually believe her. Late that evening, as the building emptied, Liam appeared in the doorway of the room. His tie loosened, his voice quiet. "You unsettled them." "Clara," she turned, startled. "I'm sorry," he shook his head. "Do not be sorry, B. Ready! Hale will not let this stand." She frowned. "Why would he care about me?" "Because he sees what I see." Liam said, "You are not afraid to break the rules, and people like Hale fear people like that." He stepped closer, his presence filling the room like a current. He said, "Tomorrow night there is a private dinner with the board at the Glass Tower. You will come." Clara blinked. "Confused? Why me?" "Because they will test you." He said, "They will poke at you like wolves, and I want them to see that you do not bleed." Then he was gone, leaving the air charged and sharp. Clara sat down hard, her mind spinning wolves. She whispered to herself, "I am just trying to survive." The next night, the Glass Tower burned with city light. As she arrived, the private dining hall was all marble and silence. The board members circled her with thin smiles. Hale at the center, his voice like polished stone. "So this is the little spark Liam has dragged in?" Clara kept her posture straight. "Yes, sir." Hale tilted his glass. "Let us see if you can burn." They questioned her relentlessly about metrics, about market risk, about her past failures. She answered each one steady, though her heart pounded. Hale smirked, finally leaning close enough that she caught the cold scent of his cologne. Do you really think you can stand in our world? Miss Hayes? Clara met his eyes and said quietly, I am already standing. The table went silent for a beat. Then Liam's laugh cut through the air low and sharp like thunder. Hale's eyes narrowed, but he said nothing. After the dinner, Liam walked her to the elevator again, his voice softer. You did well. She shook her head. They hate me, he said. Good fear is the first step to respect. The elevator doors closed between them, and she let her body sag for the first time all night. Her hands trembling, her mind blazing. She had walked into the wolf's den and walked out still whole. At home, she found another message from Liam, only 3 words this time. Do not stop. She sat on the edge of her bed staring at the glowing screen and whispered, I will not. The following days blurred into one relentless current. Clara spent her mornings buried in market data and her nights rewriting strategies like spells. She barely saw sunlight, only the glow of screens, and the constant hum of the city outside her window. Hale had become a silent storm circling her name. Whispered in meetings always with a trace of contempt, the pressure wrapped around her like ice, but she refused to crack. Liam began calling her into his office. Late after everyone else had gone home, the glass walls glowed black with the night city behind them, and only their reflections watched as they spoke. He showed her pieces of a plan not fully formed, but pulsing with danger. He said Hale is bleeding this company from the inside. He wants my seat, and he will burn anyone who stands between him. And it. Clara stared at him, cold fear sliding through her chest. Why are you telling me this? He said, because I am going to stop him, and I want you to help. She laughed softly from disbelief. He nodded. You are the only one in this building who has nothing to lose. That makes you the only one I can trust. Clara thought of Ethan back at her tiny apartment of the agency team, still depending on her of how far she had climbed from the night she walked into the wrong room. She said, if I do this and it fails, I lose everything. Liam's voice was calm. Then we make sure it does not fail. They began meeting in secret, tucked away in empty corners of Helix. At hours when the building slept, she learned how deep Hale's rot had spread. Hidden contracts, bribes, numbers buried in labyrinths of reports. She followed the trails like a ghost, her mind, a blade cutting through shadow. She worked until her hands cramped and her eyes burned, and still Liam pushed her further, saying, you have to see the shape of the enemy before you can break it. One night near midnight, she stood over a spread of documents scattered across Liam's sleek desk, her hair coming loose from its pins, her voice hoarse. Hale is using shell firms to drain R&D budgets. He is making it look like overspending. Liam leaned over her shoulder, his voice low like thunder. Then we expose him, she said. The board will bury it. He said not. If we light it on fire. Their eyes met close across the sea of papers, and for a moment the world stilled. Something unspoken, flickering between them like static. She pulled back sharply and gathered the files, saying, I will find proof. Liam only said find enough to make the world listen. For the next week, she hunted the truth like prey. She slipped through archives, she charmed wary accountants. She dug into forgotten folders until her laptop glowed with lines of numbers that whispered betrayal. She pieced them together like broken glass until a picture emerged sharp enough to cut. When she finally showed Liam the proof, he stared at the screen in silence, then said, You did it, Clara. You just rewrote the battlefield. She said now what he said. Now we make Hale swing the blade himself. Clara did not sleep. The night before the plan began, her small apartment felt too quiet, too fragile for the storm she was about to unleash. She sat on the floor surrounded by printouts, glowing screens and cold coffee, whispering through clenched teeth. You cannot fail. You cannot fail. Ethan stirred in the other room, muttering in his sleep, and she pressed her hand to her chest, willing her heart to steady. At dawn, she walked through the city with her coat pulled tight, the streets still slick with mist. The Helix Tower rose ahead like a blade, cutting the pale sky. She passed through the marble lobby with her ID badge cold against her chest. Her reflection small and sharp in the glass, she went straight to Liam's office where he stood waiting. Framed by the sprawling skyline, he looked carved from the same steel as the building. He said the board meeting is tonight by tomorrow. Hale will either be gone or I will. Clara's mouth was dry. How do we do this? Liam's voice was steady. You will feed him the bait and I will pull the line. She spent the day planting pieces of the truth like seeds, leaving certain files unlocked during routine audits, arranging for Hale's aides to overhear fragments of conversations about an emergency budget review. It had to look like panic. It had to smell like blood. Hale took the bait faster than she expected. By late afternoon, she caught him watching her from across the atrium, his eyes cold and bright like a predator. At 6, the board gathered in the top floor chamber, the room all glass and white steel, the ocean dark beyond the windows. Hale sat with calm poise, his silver cufflinks glinting. Liam stood at the head of the table, his voice smooth and precise. We have a problem. He said R&D budgets are hemorrhaging and someone is hiding the wound. Hale smiled faintly, pretending boredom accusations are dangerous without evidence. Liam said, Then let us have evidence. Clara. She stepped forward, her knees made of stone, her hands steady only because she forced them to be. She laid out the trail she had. Built contracts, ghost companies, falsified invoices, numbers that spiraled into nothing. Her words cut through the room like cold wind. She ended with the name, Hale's name. Silence roared. The board shifted like startled animals. Hale laughed low and soft. Clever, Miss Hayes. Very clever, but forged numbers do not topple men like me. Liam said they are not forged. He pressed a button, and the screen behind him lit up with recordings, wire transfers, emails, signatures, every piece of proof. Clara had found, and more she had not known, he had them. He had been collecting knives in the dark. Hale's smile cracked. The board erupted, voices overlapping like crashing waves. Hale rose his chair, toppling, his voice sharp. You planned this, you traitor. Liam's tone stayed calm. You plan to hollow this company from the inside and wear its shell. I am merely cutting you out before the rot spreads. Security waited outside. They stepped in like shadows and Hale froze. Realizing the fight was already over, he turned once eyes, burning into Clara, and for the first time she saw real fear in them. Then he was gone. The board sat stunned, the room echoing with the sound of their own breathing. Liam stood like a storm, finally passing, and said, Meeting adjourned. Clara stood rooted to the floor, her chest tight. Her mind blank. She had expected victory to feel like triumph. But it felt like the moment after lightning, when the world holds its breath. She followed Liam out into the empty hallway, her voice barely a whisper. We won, he said, not yet. But the board will not follow him now, and that is enough. They rode the elevator down in silence, the city lights climbing around them. She stared at their reflections in the glass. Her heart wild, she whispered, What happens to me now? Liam said, Now they will come for you instead. You stood against him, they will want to break you. She laughed hollow. I have been broken before. He looked at her. Then not cold. Not sharp, but like someone seeing sunlight for the first time, and said, That is why you scare them. When the doors opened, she stepped out and realized her legs were shaking. She turned back to him, her voice thin. Why did you choose me? Liam said. Because you walked into the wrong room and did not run. She left the building and walked through the sleepless city, her mind echoing with his words. You walked into the wrong room and did not run. Her phone buzzed as she reached her apartment, a single message from him. Rest tonight, fire tomorrow. She stood in the dark stairwell, staring at the glowing screen. Then whispered to herself, Tomorrow, then. The day of the announcement rose cold and clear, the city glowing pale gold under the early sun. Clara stood at her apartment window, clutching a mug of coffee. Gone cold, her stomach too knotted to drink. She had not slept, her mind replaying every second of the last week. Hale's face when he realized the trap had closed the board's silence, the way Liam had looked at her like a weapon he had forged. At 8, she dressed in her one good suit and braided. Her hair with shaking hands, Ethan watched from the couch, still in his pajamas. Mama, are you going to win today? She knelt and kissed his forehead softly. I already did, baby, just by standing there. He hugged her fiercely. Be brave, Mama. She carried his words like armor as she crossed the lobby of the Helix Tower, the marble floors cold under her heels, the air thick with whispers. The press crowded outside, flashes popping against the glass like static security, guided her to a private elevator that rose and rose until it opened onto the top floor where the board waited. The conference chamber gleamed all glass and steel and tension. The directors lined the long table silent. Liam stood at the head dressed in black. Like a shadow cut from stone, his eyes flicked to her and something subtle shifted in his posture, as if the storm inside him eased for a breath. He spoke first, his voice cold and clean. Hale has resigned effective. Immediately his actions compromise the stability of this company, the board. Accepts his removal, the words fell like iron. The directors nodded grim and subdued. Then Liam turned to Clara, and the world tilted. "Miss Hayes," he said, "you exposed the breach. You saved our future. The board has agreed to retain your firm permanently and appoint you as strategic lead on the restoration initiative." For a heartbeat, she could not breathe. Her throat burned, her hands trembled. She forced her voice, "Steady, thank you, sir. I will not fail you." Liam's gaze held hers like a wire between storms. "See that you do not." The meeting dissolved into fragments. Voices, questions, signatures, the directors dispersing like smoke. Clara stood still in the center of it, numb, the woman who had walked into the wrong room, now standing where empires turned. Hours later, she found herself alone in a quiet hallway, staring at the skyline, the city blazing below her. She felt hollow and electric all at once. Liam appeared silently at her side, his reflection tall beside hers. "You did it," he said quietly. She laughed weak and shaky. "Did I?" He nodded. "Hale is gone and the board will not touch you now." She looked at him, her voice thin. "What happens now?" "Now," he said, "we rebuild." By evening, the tower glowed like a beacon against the dark sky. The rooftop hall transformed into a stage for the world screens lined the walls, streaming live feeds from across the globe. Banners of Helix shimmered under white light. Clara stood backstage with her badge clipped to her jacket, her heart slamming like a drum, the murmur of the press seeping through the curtains. Alan found her there, his tie crooked, his grin wide. "You realize what you just did?" "Right," she whispered. "I have no idea. He said you toppled a king, and then sat on the throne." She almost laughed, but the sound caught in her throat. Liam appeared behind them, silent as ever, his black suit crisp, his presence. "Electric ready, Clara?" he asked, and she nodded, though her legs felt carved from ice. They stepped out into the blaze of lights, the crowd rising in a wave of noise. Cameras flashed like lightning. Liam moved to the podium, and the roar hushed at once. His voice rolled out steady and cold as steel. "Helix has stood at the edge of collapse and risen stronger. We owe that to those who dared to defy fear." He turned to her, and the world stilled. "Miss Clara Hayes," he said, "saved this company from the fire and taught us how to walk through it." Applause thundered around her, lights burning her vision white. She stepped forward on shaking legs and stood beside him. He leaned close enough that only she heard his words. "This is your moment. Do not blink." She faced the sea of cameras, her voice carrying clear, though her chest ached. "Helix is not just numbers. It is people who dare to rebuild when the world wants them silent. I walked into the wrong room once, and instead I found where I belonged." The silence that followed cracked into a roar of applause. Liam watched her with that faint, sharp smile, like he had seen the shape of this moment, long before it existed. Later, after the press had vanished, and the hall stood empty, they rode the private elevator down through the sleeping tower, the city lights bleeding upward around them. Clara leaned back against the glass, her body trembling from exhaustion. He said softly, "You burned the world tonight," she whispered. "Did we win?" He said, "We survived, that is better." When the doors opened, he walked her to the street. The air cold and clean, the sky streaked with neon. He stopped there, hands in his pockets, and looked at her for a long moment. Not as his weapon, not as his gamble, but as something new. "Do you remember what I told you in that hospital room?" he asked. She nodded barely. "You said I walked into destiny." He smiled faintly. "You did." Then he turned and vanished back into the tower like the tide retreating from the shore. Clara stood alone on the empty street, the city humming around her. The girl who had once stumbled into the wrong room, now standing at the edge of the world. She looked up at the burning skyline and whispered to herself, I am not leaving this room ever again. Weeks passed and the world began to reshape around her. Clara woke every morning before dawn in her new office apartment, perched halfway up the Helix Tower glass walls, spilling sunrise across the floor, the city glowing beneath her. Like a map of fire, she would sit there for long minutes, watching it all with her coffee gone cold, wondering how she had walked from the edge of failure to this. Her days blurred with meetings, press calls, and endless strategy sessions. She moved through the building like part of its steel bones, her heels sharp on the marble, her voice steadier than she felt. The board spoke to her with thin smiles. Now, some wary, some respectful. Her team at the agency had doubled their staff, riding the wave of her victory. She should have felt triumphant, but inside she often felt hollow, like she had climbed so high she could not hear her own heart anymore. Liam drifted in and out of her days, like weather, sometimes silent and cold, sometimes burning with sudden intensity. They spoke mostly in private after hours, their conversations quiet and sharp. He would lean over her desk while the building slept, asking about campaigns and market predictions. But sometimes his eyes lingered like he was seeing something beyond the numbers. One night he found her asleep at her desk, her head on a scatter of notes. He said softly, "You will break like this." She stirred, blinking awake. "I cannot stop. There is too much." He said, "There will always be too much if you do not stop it yourself," she whispered. "How do you stop?" He said, You survive until you do not have to anymore." After that night, he started showing up with small mercies, black coffee without asking silence. When she needed it, sometimes just sitting near while she worked, as if his presence alone could hold her together. But the world outside their glass tower did not forgive so easily. The press clawed at her with stories about her rise, calling her ruthless, manipulative, dangerous. Sponsors pulled old failures from her past and paraded them like proof that she was an accident waiting to happen. She smiled on camera while inside fear gnawed at her bones. One evening she found Liam waiting at her door, the skyline burning behind him. He said, "Come with me," and offered no explanation. They drove in silence to the coastline where the city ended and the black water began. They stood on the rocks while the wind tore at their clothes. She said, "I do not know how to breathe up there anymore." He said, "Then breathe down here." They stayed like that for hours, saying nothing, the tide hissing at their feet until the noise in her head finally went quiet. When he drove her back to the tower, she slept for the first time in weeks, dreamless and deep. The next morning, she walked through the lobby lighter, her steps no longer echoing with panic. She realized then that Liam had not saved her from the fire. He had simply stood beside her until she remembered she could walk through it. The weeks after the night on the coast felt different, lighter. Somehow Clara still worked until her hands cramped and her eyes burned, but the edge of panic had dulled. She had stopped waiting for the ground to vanish under her feet. She began laughing again, sometimes quietly in the elevator, sometimes louder when Alan sent her chaotic voice notes about campaigns going viral. She caught her reflection in the glass one evening and saw someone she did not recognize. Someone steady, someone unafraid. Liam watched the change in silence at first, his gaze following her in meetings, his questions sharper, his approval rarer but more real. One night as they reviewed the next quarter projections, he said, "You are not fighting ghosts anymore?" she asked. "What do you mean?" He said, "You used to walk like the floor might vanish. You do not anymore." She wanted to tell him it was because of him, because of the way he had stood beside her when the world wanted her gone, but she only said quietly, "Maybe I learned how to stay." They began having dinner after late nights of work. Nothing extravagant, just food from the kitchen downstairs, eaten on the floor of his office while the skyline glowed around them. Sometimes they talked about the company, sometimes about nothing at all. She learned he hated elevators and loved thunderstorms. He learned she painted when she could not sleep. One night as rain streaked down the glass, Liam set his tablet aside and said, I never believed in fate." Clara looked up from her coffee and he continued, "Then you walked into the wrong room and made me wonder if I have been wrong all along." Her breath caught. She said softly, "I walked into the wrong room and you changed my whole life." Silence stretched between them, not sharp, not tense, just full. Like something new beginning, he stood and walked to the window, looking out at the city lights, and said without turning, "Do not leave this place, Clara. Not just the company. I mean this place where you are now." She stood beside him, the glass cold under her palm, the city endless below. She whispered, "I am not planning to leave." He turned his head slightly, his profile sharp against the stormlight, and for the first time his smile was small and unguarded. Not the smile of a man who ruled an empire, but of a man who had been waiting for something without knowing it. They stayed like that for a long time, saying nothing, while the rain whispered down the glass and the city hummed below them. Later, when she returned to her apartment, Ethan was asleep, curled small under the blankets. She tucked the covers around him and stood in the doorway for a long while, the sound of his breathing steady like an anchor. She walked to the window and looked out at the tower burning against the dark sky, her reflection faint over the light. She whispered to herself, "I walked into the wrong room and found where I belong." And for the first time, she believed it completely.